She stood in the middle of the main street with a tattered suitcase and a broken heart, rejected by three men in front of the whole town in a single afternoon. No money, no home, no future. People whispered behind her back that no one would choose a woman like her. But then, a stranger, a widower, knelt before her in the crowd. Not for love, because he needed someone brave enough. This is the story of Clara Whitmore, a woman abandoned by the world, and how she found her true place. Watch to the end, hit like, and comment with the name of the city you're watching in so I know how far my story has come. The stagecoach pulled into Granger's Hollow on a Tuesday, which Clara Whitmore would later decide was the worst possible day of the week to have your entire future collapse in public. She stepped down onto the main street with her traveling bag in one hand and a small leather satchel in the other. And the first thing she noticed was how flat the town looked, flat and dry and wide open in a way that offered nowhere to hide. The second thing she noticed was that three men were already watching her from the porch of the land office across the street. She recognized them from the correspondence she'd carried in her satchel for the past 6 weeks. Rufus Calloway, who ran the grain mill, Tobias Hecht, the cattle buyer, and a man she knew only as Mr. Arvid Swan, who had described himself in his letters as a gentleman of property and moderate temperament, which she'd taken as a reasonable if uninspiring endorsement. She was 31 years old. She had $42 to her name. She had been traveling for 11 days from a town in Missouri that hadn't offered her much to begin with, and even less to return to. Clara smoothed her skirt with the back of her hand, straightened the collar of her coat, which was decent but not new, and crossed the street. The Calloway interview lasted 9 minutes. She knew because she counted, sitting across from Rufus Calloway in the small room he'd arranged at the back of the land office, which smelled like grain dust and old pipe smoke. He was a big man with a red face and the particular manner of someone who'd made a decision before she even sat down. He looked at her hands first, then her face. Then he glanced at some paper on the table in front of him, though she couldn't see what was written on it. "You're older than your advertisement said," he told her. Clara kept her expression steady. "My advertisement stated my age plainly. I am 31. He folded his hands. "I was expecting someone a bit more." He made a vague gesture. "My mother was a handsome woman. I suppose I had expectations." "I see. I run a busy mill. I need someone who presents well. For the community standing, you understand. It's not a personal remark." It was entirely a personal remark, but she didn't say so. She thanked him for his time and left the room. Tobias Hecht was, if anything, worse, though in a different way. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 26, with the look of a man who'd been told his entire life that he was more interesting than he actually was. He talked for the first 4 minutes without asking her a single question, about his cattle operation, about a horse he'd recently purchased, about some dispute he'd had with a neighboring rancher that she gathered she was meant to find impressive. When he finally paused, she said, "You mentioned in your letters that you had 2 children. He looked caught out. "They're with my sister. That arrangement is working fine. But you wrote that you needed someone to—" "I've been reconsidering the arrangement," he said. He had the grace to look at the table when he said it, at least. "I think what I actually need is someone with more polish, social ease. My business requires a certain kind of, She didn't know, but she understood clearly enough. She stood, took her satchel, and left without extending her hand. She stood on the porch of the land office for a moment and looked down the street. Granger's Hollow had one general store, a blacksmith, a small hotel, a church at the far end, and what she counted as 4 saloons. It was not an inspiring town, but she'd been in worse. A woman in a blue dress came out of the general store across the way and stopped to stare openly at her. A man in an apron, the blacksmith, probably, had paused his work and was looking over. 2 older women stood on the corner near the church, talking in the particular way of women who are discussing something they're pretending not to be discussing. Clara was aware, in a sharp and uncomfortable way, that she had become the spectacle of the afternoon. The interview with Arvid Swan lasted 11 minutes, which made it the longest of the 3 and the strangest. He was perhaps 50, with a carefully trimmed beard and an expression of permanent mild concern, as though he were always slightly worried about something but couldn't quite remember what. He asked her genuine questions, where she'd come from, what work she knew, whether she could manage a household, and she answered them honestly and thought, briefly, that perhaps this one might be different. Then he said very quietly, "May I ask what happened to your previous circumstances?" "I'm not sure what you mean." "You're 31. You haven't been married. I'm asking—" He cleared his throat. There was some talk from the man who arranged the advertisement, something about a previous engagement. Clara looked at him steadily. "I was engaged once. The man decided against it." "I see. And was there—" Another throat clearing. "I don't mean to be indelicate." "Then perhaps don't be." He had the decency to look embarrassed. "I've 3 daughters from my first wife," he said. "I can't afford to bring someone into my home who carries— I need to be careful about reputation. The community standard. You understand?" She understood. She'd understood all 3 of them. They each had different ways of saying the same thing, which was that she didn't meet some standard she hadn't been told about and couldn't have changed anyway. She thanked him for his time and walked out onto the main street. By then it was mid-afternoon, and the street was not empty. Clara stood on the boardwalk with her traveling bag and her satchel and was acutely aware that she had nowhere to go. She had the $42. She had what she was wearing. She had 3 rejections inside of 2 hours. She had a return ticket she couldn't afford and a town in Missouri she didn't want to return to. The 2 women near the church had moved closer. She could hear, not quite words, but the rhythm of commentary. A group of men outside one of the saloons had taken an interest. Even the stagecoach driver, who was watering his horses at the end of the block, was watching with the careful blankness of someone trying to appear as though they weren't. She picked a direction, toward the small hotel, and started walking. "That's her," she heard clearly from somewhere to her left. A woman's voice. "The one who came out on the advertisement. All 3 turned her down, they say. In the same afternoon." She kept walking. "Can't say I'm surprised," a second voice said. "She's got a certain—" She stopped hearing them, or made herself stop, which was a skill she'd developed over the last several years. She focused on the boards beneath her feet, the heat, the sound of the horses, the smell of dust and axle grease. She had $42 and 11 days of travel behind her, and she was standing in a town she hadn't heard of 6 weeks ago. She was genuinely trying, not to let the afternoon swallow her whole. She made it as far as the step of the hotel before she sat down on the bench outside it and let herself breathe for a moment, which was as close to falling apart as she allowed herself. She didn't cry. She wanted to. She sat there on the bench with her hands folded in her lap and felt the precise pressure of tears that she refused to release, and she made a kind of accounting in her head, the way she'd done it before. When her father had gone, when the engagement had dissolved, when Missouri had made clear, in its quiet, relentless way, that it had no particular use for her. She was good at not crying in public. She'd had practice. "You're Clara Whitmore?" The voice came from her left. She turned. The man standing at the edge of the boardwalk was maybe 40, though the sun and the work had put years on him that she couldn't quite accurately read. He was tall, with the particular build of someone who spent most of their life doing hard physical labor. Not lean exactly, but without any extra to him either. His hat was weathered, his coat was decent, his face was the kind that didn't offer much at first look. Set jaw, watchful eyes, the expression of someone who'd gotten in the habit of measuring things carefully before committing. "I am," she said. He looked at her for a moment, not the way the others had, not assessing her for presentation or reputation or what she might reflect back on him. More like he was deciding something that had nothing to do with her at all, and she just happened to be part of the calculation. "I'm Elias Boone," he said. "I've got a ranch about 12 miles east. I came in today for supplies. Wasn't planning on—" He paused. "I heard what happened. Most of the town heard, I think." "Yes," she said. "I gathered that." "I'm sorry about it. That's not—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not sorry in a pitying way. I mean, it was unkind, and it shouldn't have been done like that." She looked at him steadily. "What can I do for you, Mr. Boone?" He took his hat off. It was a deliberate gesture, she thought. Not theatrical, just careful. He held it in both hands. "My wife died 14 months ago," he said. "I've got 2 children." A daughter who's 8, name of Nora. A son who's 11, name of Cal. I'm not I'm not looking for a mother for them exactly. I don't think that's what they need right now. But I need someone who can hold the household together while I run the ranch. Someone who can be steady when I can't be. Clara waited. I know this isn't what you came out here for, he said. And I know I'm nobody's first choice today, and you're probably in no mood to hear another proposal. But I'll be straight with you, which is more than those other men were, I think. You're proposing to me, she said. Right now. On this bench. In front of... She looked out at the street, where at least 11 people had stopped pretending not to watch. All of this. I am, he said. He didn't look away from her. I won't kneel down. My knee's been giving me trouble. But I'll ask you honestly. Despite herself, something in her chest moved. Not romance. She wasn't a fool about that. But something else. Some surprised, ragged recognition. You don't know anything about me, she said. I know you sat down on that bench and didn't fall apart, he said. I know you walked out of 3 rooms today without making a scene, which most people wouldn't manage. And I know you've got no good options right now, and neither do I. And I'd rather be honest about that than pretend otherwise. She looked at him. What are your terms? She said. They talked for nearly an hour on that bench, and then they moved to the hotel's small dining room, where the proprietress pretended to be busy at the counter while listening to every word. Elias was not a smooth talker. He was actually rather bad at it. He'd start a sentence, lose track of it, come at the thing from another direction. He said, I suppose, and I think, more than was probably useful. But everything he said seemed true, which Clara found she valued more than she'd have expected. His wife's name had been Margaret. She'd died of a fever in the winter before last. The children had taken it hard, but Nora especially, who had nightmares still, and Cal, who decided at some point that the way to survive it was to refuse to feel anything about it at all. The ranch was functional, he said, though the word cost him something. He didn't say it was flourishing. I can't promise you love, he said at one point directly. I think that would be dishonest. I don't know what I've got left of that right now. I'm not asking for it, she said. I can promise fair treatment and honest partnership. I'll tell you what I need and I'll listen to what you need. I've got enough room in the house and I'll not be cruel. That's a low bar, she said. I know it is, but I've met enough men who don't clear it. He looked down at his hat, which was still in his hands. I'm trying to tell you what I actually have, not what sounds good. Clara thought about the grain mill, about Tobias Hecht and his absent children, about Arvid Swan's careful worry about reputation. She thought about Missouri and the $42 and the return ticket and going back to nothing. She thought about the bench and sitting on it and not crying. I have conditions, she said. He looked up. All right. I'll not be treated as hired help. If I'm your wife, I'm your wife. I have a say in the household and I expect to be heard when I speak. Fair. I won't try to replace your wife with those children. I won't pretend I'm something I'm not or force anything that has to be grown naturally. But I won't be shut out either. If I'm in that house, I'm in it as someone who matters. Also fair. And if it doesn't work, if it's genuinely not working after 6 months, we talk about it honestly instead of one of us just going silent. He nodded slowly. I can agree to that. She looked at him. He had honest eyes. Tired, she thought, and caring more than he let on, but honest. The kind of eyes that had probably never been very good at disguising things. All right, Mr. Boone, she said. I'll go with you. They were married that evening by the justice of the peace in a room that smelled like old books and wood polish. The proprietress of the hotel served as witness, along with a man named Garrett, who was the justice's neighbor and seemed to have been pulled in off the street. It was not a ceremony of any particular sentiment. Elias said the words in a measured, careful way. Clara said them clearly. Garrett looked like he'd rather be elsewhere. The proprietress looked like she was storing every detail to discuss for a month. When it was done, they stood outside in the early dark, and there was a moment that felt strange in a way Clara couldn't quite name. Not romantic, not solemn, just strange. Like the particular feeling of a door closing behind you in a room you'd lived in for a long time. My wagon's at the livery, Elias said. We should start out early. The road's easier in the cool. All right, she said. They walked to the livery in something that was almost a companionable silence, which surprised her. She'd expected awkward. He didn't seem like a man who filled silence for the sake of it, and she was too tired to perform pleasantness, so they walked quietly side by side through the narrow street of Granger's Hollow, past the saloons and the general store and the church at the end, and she tried to take stock of what had happened to her day. She had come here with $42 and a correspondence arrangement and the thin hope of a new start. She had been turned away, publicly, by 3 men in the course of a single afternoon. She had sat on a bench and refused to cry. And she was now, as of about 40 minutes ago, the wife of a man she hadn't known existed this morning. The frontier, she thought, had a peculiar sense of humor. The wagon was a good solid farm wagon, not new, but maintained. 2 horses, both sensible-looking, a few crates of supplies in the bed, and a canvas tied down over them against the night air. Elias helped her up to the seat with a hand that was brief and businesslike, and she settled there and watched him check the hitch, with the same careful attention he'd brought to their conversation. He did things thoroughly, she noticed, without wasted motion. Tell me about the children, she said when he climbed up beside her. He released a breath that was almost, not quite, a sigh. She's a good girl, sweet. She misses her mother every day and she doesn't hide it. She'll probably take to you or want to take to you, though she may not know how at first. And Cal. There was a pause. Cal is harder, Elias said. He's 11 and he's carrying a lot of anger that he doesn't know what to do with. He's not a bad kid. He searched. He decided, after his mother died, that what happened was that she chose to leave. I know that's not reasonable, but you can't reason a child out of something they've decided in their grief. He's been difficult with anyone who comes near the house since. He was difficult with visitors. Some women from the town came around in the first months, trying to help. He wasn't. Elias's jaw tightened slightly. He made it difficult. Clara absorbed this. He'll likely make it difficult for me. Probably. You're warning me. I'm telling you what's true, he said. I should have told you on the bench, but I didn't want to put you off before you'd heard the rest. She almost smiled at that. So there was salesmanship after all. He glanced at her. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close. A little, he admitted. I'm sorry. Don't be. I'd have done the same. The horses moved out of the livery and into the street. The town of Granger's Hollow spread out around them, small, flat, dry, already fading into darkness. The people who'd watched her all afternoon were indoors now, or at the saloons or wherever they went when the show was over. She didn't look back at it. The road east was dark and the stars were considerable. The kind of sky you couldn't get near a city, wide and deep and indifferent in a way that she actually found comforting rather than lonely. She'd always preferred honesty in her landscapes, even when the honesty was uncomfortable. They rode mostly in silence for a time. The horses had their own rhythm, and the wagon swayed with it, and Clara sat with her hands in her lap and watched the dark prairie come at them and fall away behind. What did you do? Elias said eventually. Before this? Taught school, she said. For a few years. Before that I kept house for my father. He died 3 years ago. Siblings? One brother. He married and went west, Oregon. I haven't heard from him in, she calculated, 14 months about. Elias was quiet for a moment. I've got a sister in Kansas. We write when we think of it. What made you come into town today, she said. You said you were there for supplies. I was. That was true. He adjusted the reins slightly. I've been thinking about the situation for a few months. My neighbor's wife mentioned the arrangement that people sometimes advertised. I'd been putting off doing anything about it because, he stopped. Because it felt like a betrayal of your wife, Clara said. He looked at her, then back at the road. Something like that. Did you go to the land office today with any intention of... No, he said, and the honesty of it was abrupt and clear. I saw you on that bench and He shook his head. I don't know exactly. Something about how you were sitting there. You looked like someone who'd taken a hard knock and wasn't going to let it put her down. But it wasn't bravado either. It was just, you were going to sit there until you figured out what to do next. Clara thought about that for a moment. That's a lot to read into someone sitting on a bench. Probably, he said. I've been wrong about things before. Have you been wrong about many? Some. A pause. Not this one, I think. She didn't answer that. It felt too early and too uncertain to answer, and she respected him enough not to offer him reassurance she couldn't guarantee. But she filed it away, the thing he'd said, and held it with a certain cautious care. They stopped once, a few hours in, to water the horses at a creek that ran thin but steady across the road. She climbed down and stretched her back, and stood in the dark by the water, and listened to the creek and the insects and the horses breathing, and thought, this is my life now. This dark road, this quiet man, this direction I don't know anything about. She thought about the bench. She thought about the hotel dining room, and the words she'd said and the words he'd said. She thought about Nora, who might take to her, and Cal, who probably wouldn't. She thought, I've started over before. I know how it goes. It doesn't go smoothly. It goes forward, which is the only direction that matters. The stars were very large overhead. The creek was cold when she touched her fingers to it, fed from somewhere higher up, still carrying the memory of cold. Ready? Elias said from near the horses. Yes, she said, and climbed back up, and they went forward into the dark. She must have slept at some point because she became aware of the sky lightening to the east and realized she'd been asleep against her own shoulder, which had gone somewhat stiff. She straightened and felt the morning air against her face, cooler now, and carrying the smell of grass and distance. The ranch came into view as the sun broke the horizon. It was not a grand property. She hadn't expected it to be. It was a working ranch, which meant it had the look of something built in stages as money and time allowed. The main house solid but unpainted, a large barn that had seen better decades, a series of outbuildings and fenced areas stretching out in multiple directions. There were cattle in a distant field. Smoke came from the chimney. Someone was up. My neighbor's boy stays with the children when I'm gone overnight, Elias said. He'll be getting breakfast on. Clara looked at the house, at the smoke, at the fenced yard and the barn, and the particular quiet of early morning over a working property. She thought, someone is going to open that door in a moment. 2 children are in there who didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask for it either. Neither did the man beside me. And here we all are anyway, going toward each other in the early light, carrying everything we've got, which is not as much as any of us would like. She tucked her traveling bag under her arm and straightened her coat. The door opened before they reached it. A girl stood in the doorway, small for 8, with dark hair loose around her face and her father's watchful eyes. She looked at the wagon, at her father, and then at Clara. Her face went through something complicated, hope and caution, and a particular grief that was too large for an 8-year-old's face, but was there nonetheless. She stood in the doorway and looked at Clara the way you look at something you want very much, and are terrified to want. Papa, she said, This is Clara, Elias said, climbing down from the wagon. She's come to live with us now. She's bus. He paused, and Clara understood that he was navigating the same careful territory she was, trying to name a thing that didn't have a clean name yet. She's your father's wife. You can decide what else she is to you, in time. Nora looked at Clara. Clara looked at Nora. Hello, Clara said. I've heard good things about you. Papa told you about me? On the ride, she said. He said you were a good girl. He said you were smart. Something moved across the child's face. She didn't smile. It wasn't that easy, and it shouldn't have been. But the tension in her small shoulders shifted slightly, and she stepped back from the door to let them in. From inside the house, Clara could hear the sounds of a boy moving around, the particular sounds of someone who did not want to be heard coming closer, who was listening anyway. She stepped over the threshold into her new house. It smelled like wood smoke and coffee, and beneath that, something harder to name. The particular scent of a home that was missing something it used to have, something in the air that was waiting. She set down her traveling bag just inside the door. Outside, the sun was fully up now. The ranch was waking. Somewhere in a distant field, cattle moved through the morning grass, and the day, ordinary and demanding and already underway, came forward to meet her. The first morning was the easiest one, which Clara would later understand was simply because nobody had figured out yet how to be difficult. Nora showed her where things were kept. The flour in the lower cabinet, the good pot on the left hook, the well out back that ran clean but needed priming in cold weather. She did it with the particular seriousness of a child who had taken on responsibilities too large for her and didn't know whether to be proud or sad about it. Clara followed her from room to room and listened carefully and asked questions only when she needed to, because she could see that Nora needed to be the one who knew things, at least for now. That was a kind of dignity, and Clara wasn't going to take it from her. Cal stayed out of it. He was in the barn when they arrived, and he stayed in the barn through breakfast. And when he finally came in to eat, he sat at the far end of the table and put food in his mouth, with the mechanical focus of someone who has decided that if he doesn't look at a thing, it doesn't exist. He was tall for 11, with his father's jaw and something harder in his eyes than an 11-year-old should have had to develop. Clara said good morning to him, and he nodded once, minimally, without looking up. Elias watched this and said nothing, which Clara thought was probably the right call. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. After breakfast, Elias went out to the ranch work and took Cal with him, and Clara and Nora were left alone in the kitchen with a stack of dishes and the particular quiet of two people who don't yet know what they are to each other. "I can wash," Clara said, "if you want to dry, or the other way around." "I usually wash," Nora said, "then I'll dry." It was not a profound arrangement, but it was something. They worked side by side at the basin, and the water was warm, and the morning came through the window in long, pale slants. And after a while, Nora said, "Did you have children before? In your other place?" "No," Clara said. "Why not?" "I wasn't married before." Nora considered this while scrubbing a pot. "Were you sad about it?" Clara thought about the honest answer. "Sometimes. Not always. I kept busy. Papa says keeping busy helps." "It does," Clara said. "Some." Nora handed her the pot to dry. "It doesn't help with everything." "No," Clara agreed. "It doesn't." Well, the ranch made demands on her that she had not fully anticipated, and she was honest enough with herself to admit she had underestimated them. She knew housekeeping. She'd kept her father's house for 7 years and managed a classroom of 23 children for 3 before that, so she was not frightened of work or of difficult circumstances. But the ranch operated at a scale and rhythm that had its own logic, and the first week was largely spent trying to understand that logic before she made mistakes she couldn't undo. The house had been managed in a patchwork way since Margaret died. Nora had taken over what she could reach and understand, Elias had done the rest in the margins of ranch work, and some things had simply stopped being done because there was no one left to do them. Clara found this in layers, a pile of mending in a basket under the stairs that went back months, provisions that had run low without anyone noticing until they were gone, a leaking seam at the back of the roof that had been patched with tar but needed proper fixing before winter. She didn't announce these things. She just started on them, quietly, methodically, the way she'd learned to start on problems, by picking up the closest piece first and working her way through. Elias noticed. She could tell he noticed because he watched her with a certain careful attention when he came in from the range in the evenings, like a man checking a calculation he wasn't sure about. He didn't say much, but one evening near the end of the first week he came in and found her restitching the lining of Cal's winter coat, which had been coming apart at the seam since probably last year, and he stood in the doorway for a moment and said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said, without looking up from the stitching. He sat down across from her, which was the first time he'd sat in the main room in the evening, rather than going directly to his account books after supper. He picked up the mug she'd left for him. She'd started leaving coffee for him, because he always wanted it and never asked, and was quiet for a moment. "Cal should have told me that coat needed work," he said. "Boys that age don't notice things like that," she said. "Or they notice and they don't think it's worth mentioning. I should have seen it. You have a ranch to run and 2 children to raise on 4 hours of sleep. There are only so many things one person can see." He looked at her. It wasn't an uncomfortable look. It was just direct, the way he did most things. "You're making it easier for me to feel like I've been failing. That's not what I'm doing." "No," he said after a moment. "I don't think it is." He drank his coffee. Clara finished the seam. The fire made its sounds, and somewhere upstairs Nora was doing the particular thing she did before sleep, which was to read aloud to herself in a soft voice that you could hear through the ceiling if you were quiet. It was a strange comfort, that sound, in a house that had been short on comfort for a while. Cal's hostility was not loud. That was the thing about it that made it harder to manage. A loud hostility you could address. You could say, plainly, that a certain thing wasn't acceptable, and work from there. Cal's was quieter and more thorough. He responded when spoken to, minimally. He ate what was put in front of him. He did his chores without being asked twice. But he did all of it in a way that made clear he was doing it despite her presence, and not in any way because of it. And there was a careful, consistent blankness he put between himself and Clara that she could not find an edge on. She tried different approaches. She tried warmth, and she tried simple practicality, and she tried leaving him entirely alone to see if absence was less threatening than presence. None of it moved him. About 2.5 weeks in, she was in the barn looking for a tool Elias had asked about, and she found Cal up in the loft, sitting on a hay bale in the particular posture of a boy who had been crying recently and was angry about it. His back was partly to the ladder, and he didn't hear her come up, and she saw it, the set of his jaw, the redness around his eyes, the way he had his arms crossed over his chest like he was holding himself together. She stood at the top of the ladder. He heard her and turned, and the expression that went across his face was the same one she'd seen before, the blankness dropping into place like a shutter. "I'm not doing anything," he said, defensive and immediate. "I know," she said. "I'm looking for the hand plane. Your father said it was up here somewhere." He pointed without speaking to a shelf along the far wall. She went and got it, and then she almost left, because the instinct was to leave, to not push, to give him the space and the privacy he was so obviously guarding. But she stood there for a moment with the hand plane in her hand, and she thought about the mending basket and the leaking roof and all the things that had gone unaddressed in this house for more than a year, and she decided that some things were worth the risk of making worse. "I'm not trying to be your mother," she said. She didn't look at him when she said it. She looked at the hand plane in her hands. "I know you had one. I know she wasn't me and I'm not her, and that's just true, and I'm not going to pretend around it." Silence. "I also know," she said, "that it's harder to be angry at the thing that actually happened than to be angry at the nearest available person. I've done that too." She heard him shift on the hay bale, but she didn't look. "I'm going to be here," she said. "I'm not going to make a large thing of it, but I'm going to be here. And when you decide you're finished being angry at me for something I didn't do, I'll still be here. That's all." She climbed back down the ladder and went back to the house. He didn't speak to her any differently that evening. But he came into supper without being called for the first time since she'd arrived. And he ate all of his food. And once, just once, when she asked him to pass the salt, he did it without making her feel invisible. It was a small thing. She held it carefully anyway. The work was relentless in the way that ranch work always was. It didn't pause for weather or illness or difficulty. It came every day at the same hour and demanded the same things regardless of what you felt about it. Clara settled into the rhythm of it in the way she settled into most hard things, by finding the structure inside the difficulty and building her days along that structure. She was up before Elias, had the stove going and coffee ready by the time he came down. She managed the household through the middle of the day, the cooking and the mending and the particular ongoing task of keeping a working property from descending into chaos. And in the afternoons, she helped Nora with her lessons, because the nearest school was 11 miles away, and the weather didn't always allow the trip. Nora was sharp and eager and had the delightful habit of asking questions that were 3 steps ahead of the lesson, which reminded Clara of why she'd loved teaching to begin with. They worked at the kitchen table in the afternoons, and it was honestly one of the better parts of her days. The clean, simple pleasure of a child's mind working well. Cal, she discovered, had taught himself to read at a high level. He'd taken his mother's books after she died and worked through them on his own. And he had the kind of comprehension that comes from reading out of genuine hunger rather than assignment. She found this out accidentally when she came across him with a history of the Mississippi Valley that had been Margaret's and mentioned something from it. And he responded, really responded, with an opinion and an argument before he caught himself and went quiet again. She didn't make anything of it. But she started leaving books on the corner of the kitchen table, near where he usually sat for meals, just setting them there, without comment. History, mostly, and a few accounts of exploration that she thought might appeal to a boy his age. She never mentioned them. He never mentioned them. But they disappeared. The epidemic came from the south, which nobody expected because the last one had come from the east, and people had been watching the wrong direction. Clara heard about it first from a neighbor woman named Gertrude Pell, who rode over one afternoon in a state of controlled alarm. Gertrude was a practical woman of 50-something who had lived on the frontier long enough to have seen several bad things come through, and her controlled alarm was therefore more alarming than most people's panic. "It's in Cradlefork," Gertrude said, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee she wasn't drinking. "Fever and lung trouble. Started with the Hendricks family 3 weeks ago. Now it's in at least 14 households. Doc Harmon's there, but he's one man, and there are too many down." "Is it moving this way?" Clara asked. "Bill Sayers' place is 8 miles south of you. His wife's down with it. Their boy brought a message into the general store yesterday." Gertrude looked at her with a frank, measuring expression. "I'm telling folks to stock in and stay close." Clara looked at the window. Elias was out at the south pasture with Cal, a detail that now felt different than it had an hour ago. How serious? Serious enough that Harmon's not letting anybody near Cradlefork who doesn't have business there. Gertrude picked up her coffee finally, drank some of it. "I've got herbs I can bring over. Some willow bark, some elderberry stock I put up in the fall. Won't cure anything, but it helps the fever if the fever comes." "Please bring it," Clara said. "I'll add it to what I have." After Gertrude left, Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment, just thinking. 12 miles to Granger's Hollow. 8 miles to the nearest infected household. No doctor closer than 20 miles in any direction, and that doctor already overwhelmed. 2 children. A husband she'd known for less than a month. A house that was not yet fully hers, but was, in every practical sense, hers to manage. She started taking inventory. When Elias came in that evening and she told him, he took it the way she was coming to recognize as his particular way of taking bad news, very still for a moment, and then a kind of methodical reset, where you could almost see him organizing the information into action. "We've got enough in the root cellar for 3 weeks if we're careful," he said. 4 if we stretch the flour. I'll need more salt pork eventually, but not yet. The Carver Ranch is north of us. They've been clear so far. I can send word through them if we need to get something in." "Good." He sat down at the table. He'd taken his hat off and set it on the chair beside him, and he rubbed his face with both hands in the way he did when he was tired, which was often. "The children need to stay close." "I'll talk to Nora," Claire said. "Cal?" She paused. "I'll talk to Cal," he said. She looked at him. "He's been a little better this week." Elias looked up. "Has he?" "A little." She didn't elaborate because she didn't want to make more of it than it was. But she saw something shift in Elias's expression. Not relief exactly, but the particular look of a man who has been carrying a worry for a long time and has just been told it's a little lighter than he thought. "Clara," he said. "Yes." "I know it's not been—" He stopped. "I know it's harder than what I said on that bench." "You said it was hard," she said. You were honest about it." "I didn't know about the epidemic when I said it. Nobody did." She started pulling the supper things together. "We deal with what comes, Mr. Boone. Same as we always have." There was a pause, and she heard him make a small sound that was almost, not quite, a short laugh. She'd learned, in the past weeks, that this was the closest he got to laughter at something that surprised him. "You've been calling me Mr. Boone for a month," he said. "You haven't asked me to call you anything else." Another pause. "Elias," he said. "I think, at this point, it's—" "Elias is fine." "All right," she said. "Elias." The next 2 weeks had the particular quality of a held breath. Clara reorganized the household around the threat of the epidemic with a methodical attention that kept her from thinking too much about how frightening it actually was. She put up everything that could be preserved. She went through the medicine chest and cataloged it precisely and made a list of what she knew how to use and what she didn't. When Gertrude Pell came back with the herbs she'd promised, They sat together at the kitchen table and went through them, and Clara wrote down everything Gertrude knew about managing fever and lung trouble, because Gertrude had managed it before and Clara had not. "You hold the wet cloth at the back of the neck," Gertrude said. "People always do the forehead, but the neck is where it counts. And you keep them drinking as long as they can. The fever takes the water out of them, and if they run dry, you lose them faster." Clara wrote this down. "And you don't panic," Gertrude said. "I know that sounds like nothing, but the nursing goes wrong faster when the nurse panics than when she's tired. You can work through tired. You can't work through a head full of fear." "I don't panic easily," Clara said. "No," Gertrude said, looking at her steadily. "I don't think you do." The children knew something was wrong because children always know. Nora asked direct questions and Clara gave her direct, age-appropriate answers. "There's a sickness going around. We're staying close to home. We're being careful." Nora accepted this with a seriousness that pulled at something in Clara's chest. Cal didn't ask questions, but he started doing things without being asked, bringing in extra wood, checking the water level in the barrels, fixing a hinge on the barn door that had been loose for a month. Clara watched this happen and understood that it was his way of managing fear, the same way she managed hers, by making himself useful, by finding the things that could be controlled and controlling them. She thought, "This boy is more like me than he knows." The epidemic didn't hit the Boone Ranch directly, not in those first weeks. It hit the edges. The Sayers' place went dark for 10 days. No smoke, no movement, just the particular silence of a household in crisis. Word came through the Carver Ranch that 2 families in Granger's Hollow were down and that the mercantile had closed because the owner's wife was ill. Elias rode a wide circuit of the property daily and came back with reports of the same nothing. "No one sick here yet, no new word." He said it in a flat, informational way that was not reassuring but was at least honest, and Clara came to appreciate the flatness of it, the refusal to offer false comfort. It matched her own sense of the situation. One morning, toward the end of the second week of isolation, she came downstairs to find Nora already up, which was unusual. The girl was sitting at the kitchen table in the early dark with her hands in her lap and an expression that was too complicated for the early morning. "Can't sleep?" Clara said, starting the stove. "I was thinking about Mama," Nora said. Clara stopped what she was doing and looked at her. "She got sick," Nora said. "At the end. She got sick and then she wasn't here anymore." She was very steady when she said it, the steady of someone who had said it in their head so many times it had worn smooth. "Is that going to happen again?" Clara sat down across from her. "I can't tell you nobody's going to get sick," she said. "That wouldn't be honest, and you deserve honest." Nora looked at her, those watchful eyes, so like her father's. "What I can tell you," Clara said, "is that I know more about managing sickness than most, and I've been getting ready for weeks, and I'm not leaving this house. I am here. Whatever happens, I'm here." The girl looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, small, careful, like a confirmation rather than an agreement. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Clara said. She got up and went back to the stove. And Nora stayed at the table and watched her work, and the first thin light of morning came through the east window, and the house made its sounds around them, the creak and the settle and the fire taking hold. And Clara thought, this is what she needs. Not promises, just presence. The solid, boring fact of someone still being there. It was Cal who got sick first. Not the epidemic, or not exactly. It was the beginning of it, or something that wore the same face. A cough that started on a Thursday, the kind he tried to hide but that Clara could hear from 2 rooms away. By Friday evening, he had a fever. She knew the moment she saw his color at supper. He was pushing food around his plate and the flush was in his cheeks, and his eyes had that particular brightness that had nothing to do with health. She didn't make a production of it. She waited until he got up from the table and then followed him to the foot of the stairs. "Cal," she said. He turned. "Let me see," she said. He started to say he was fine, but she'd already put her hand to his forehead, and the heat in him was immediate and clear. He stood very still while she did it, which she thought was its own kind of trust. "I'm not sick," he said. "I know you're not," she said, which was a small lie, but a kind one. "But your body's working hard on something, and you need rest. Can you go upstairs without me making a thing of it? He looked at her, that careful, measuring look that was so like his father's it was almost startling. And then he said, "Is it the same sickness that's going around?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Probably not. But we're going to treat it like we're taking it seriously, because that's the sensible thing to do." He went upstairs. She heard him getting into bed, and then she went to find Elias. She found him at the barn, finishing the evening feed. She didn't keep anything from her voice. She'd learned quickly that Elias didn't want things softened, that he responded better to plain information than to careful presentation. "Cal's running a fever," she said. "Started with a cough 2 days ago. He's been hiding it." She saw him go still in the way she knew by now. "How high?" he said. "Moderate, not critical. But I want to start the willow bark tonight, and I want to watch him through the night to see where it goes." Elias set down the feed bucket. He said nothing for a moment, and Clara could read in his face what he was not saying. Margaret, she thought. He's thinking about Margaret and about a fever he couldn't manage, and about what it means when fevers move fast on people you love. "I'll sit with him," he said. "We'll both sit with him," Clara said. "Between the two of us, one of us can always be awake." He looked at her, and she saw something in his expression that was different from the careful, measuring look he usually brought to her. Something raw, something that had less armor on it. "You're sure?" he said. And it wasn't entirely a question about the nursing plan. "I'm sure," she said. He nodded. He picked up the bucket again, finished what he was doing, and they walked back to the house together through the early dark, close enough that their arms almost touched, which they sometimes did now without either of them making anything of it. A small, unconscious proximity that had grown up between them over the past weeks without being decided or planned, and that she had come to notice only because of how ordinary it felt. Inside, the fire was going. Nora was at the table with her book, looking up when they came in with that quick reading expression, the one that said she'd already calculated something was wrong. "Is Cal sick?" she said. "A little," Clara said. "He's going to be fine. I need you to go up and check that he's got water. Take the pitcher from the shelf." Nora went, efficiently, without argument. The crisis had made her more serious, if that was possible, and more useful, which Clara suspected would stay with her long after this. Clara went to the medicine chest and started pulling things out. The willow bark, the elderberry, the cloth for compresses. She worked quickly and without ceremony, and Elias stood at the edge of the kitchen and watched her. And she felt his watching not as judgment, but as something closer to faith, which was a strange and unexpected thing to feel in a kitchen at the end of a long day. But there it was. She put the pot on to boil. She laid out what she needed. She told herself quietly, in her own head, the same thing Gertrude had told her. You can work through tired. You can't work through a head full of fear. She chose not to be afraid. The night was coming down hard outside, the kind of frontier dark that had weight to it, and Cal was upstairs with a fever, and the epidemic was still somewhere to the south, and there was no doctor within 20 miles. She put the willow bark in the water and watched it start to work, and she thought, this family has been coming apart at the edges since before I got here. I came with nothing, and I've built a little, and what I've built is going to have to be enough for tonight. She turned and looked at Elias. Get some rest for a few hours, she said. I'll take the first watch. You take the second. He looked like he was going to argue. Then he looked at her face, and something in his expression settled. Wake me at midnight, he said. I will. He went. Clara picked up the cup of willow bark tea and carried it upstairs to where Cal was lying in his bed, watching the ceiling with the complicated eyes of a boy who was trying to be braver than he felt. This tastes bad, she told him, sitting on the edge of the bed and handing it over. But it'll help. He took it without complaint, drank it down, made a face, which was the most natural expression she'd seen on him in 5 weeks. Mrs. Boone, he said quietly when she was starting to get up. She paused. He was looking at the ceiling, not at her. You're going to stay up tonight, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you don't have to. I know, she said. I'm going to anyway. She stood, adjusted the blanket at his feet where it had gone crooked, and picked up the empty cup. In the hallway, she stood for a moment with her hand on the wall and breathed. He hadn't said thank you. He hadn't said anything that was easy or clear. But he had used her name, Her actual name, the name she'd taken on the bench of that hotel dining room 6 weeks ago. And she understood, in the way you understand things that don't have words yet, that it was the closest he could get to what he actually meant. She went back downstairs. The fire was burning low. She built it up and settled into the chair closest to the stairs and took up the mending she always had somewhere near and began to wait. Cal's fever broke on the third day, which felt like a reprieve but turned out to be only a pause. He came downstairs on the fourth morning looking wrung out and thinner around the face and ate 2 bowls of porridge without being asked and said almost nothing, which for Cal was actually something close to contentment. Clara watched him eat and felt the particular relief of someone who has been holding a breath for 72 hours and is finally allowed to let it go. Not all the way. You never let it go all the way on the frontier, where the next thing was always somewhere behind the current thing. But enough. Elias had sat the midnight watches without complaint, coming down when she woke him and going up without discussion, trading off in the hallway outside Cal's room in the dark, with the wordless efficiency of 2 people who have learned to trust each other's competence, even when they haven't said so. There was something in that, Clara thought, something in the way they'd managed those 3 nights that had changed the texture of the household in a way she couldn't precisely name, like a rope that had been twisted separately and was now beginning to braid. She didn't say this to anyone. She just noticed it and filed it away. Nora, for her part, had been ferociously helpful during Cal's illness in the way of a younger sibling who has discovered that usefulness is a form of control over frightening circumstances. She brought things without being asked, kept herself out of the way without being told, and checked on her brother with a frequency and a casualness designed to look like she wasn't worried when she very obviously was. On the morning Cal came downstairs, Nora sat across from him at the table and watched him eat his second bowl of porridge, and then said with great dignity, "You sounded terrible." "I know," Cal said. "I could hear you coughing through the wall." "I know." "I didn't sleep much." Cal looked at her. Something shifted in his face. The particular look of an older sibling who is annoyed and fond at the same time, and doesn't want to show either. "Sorry," he said. Nora nodded, satisfied, and went back to her own breakfast. Clara turned back to the stove so neither of them would see her expression. It was 6 days after Cal recovered that Nora got sick. And it was different. From the very first evening, it was different in a way that Clara felt before she could name. Something in the quality of the child's fever, the speed of it, the way it came on not gradually, but all at once, as though something that had been waiting had decided to stop waiting. She'd been fine at supper, quiet, but Nora was often quiet. By the time Clara went up to say goodnight, the child was already too warm, and by 10 o'clock the fever had climbed in a way that made Clara's chest go tight. She went downstairs and found Elias at the table with his account books, which he always worked on too late and which she'd given up arguing about. "Elias," she said. He heard it in her voice immediately. She could tell by the way he looked up, the way the ordinary tiredness in his face reorganized itself into something sharper. "Nora?" "Fever. It came on fast." She kept her voice even because she'd learned that her evenness helped his and his helped hers, and this was not the moment to let either of them fracture. "I need you to go to the Carvers and send for a doctor. I know Harmon's in Cradle Fork, but there must be someone. Granger's Hollow, farther if they need to go. Someone." He was already standing. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I want a doctor," she said, which was as close to the truth as she could say out loud right now. She saw it go through him, the thing she'd been watching him manage since she arrived, the particular shadow that came across his face when illness entered his house. He'd lost Margaret to a fever. He knew what fast fevers did. She could see him knowing it right now, standing in the kitchen with his coat half on, and she could see him trying not to let it swallow him. "Elias." She said his name the way you say someone's name when they're starting to go somewhere you can't follow. "I need you to ride. That's the most useful thing you can do right now. I'll be here." He looked at her. His jaw was tight. His eyes were... She didn't have a clean word for it. Raw, maybe. Or the look of a man standing at the edge of something he'd stood at the edge of before and had fallen off. "She's 8 years old," he said, and his voice was flat in the way that meant he was holding it very carefully. "I know," Clara said. "Ride, Elias. Fast. I'll have her here when you get back." It was a promise she didn't technically have the right to make, and she knew it, and she made it anyway, because he needed something solid to ride toward, and she was the only solid thing available. He went. She heard the horse go fast out of the yard, and then she turned and went upstairs. Papa? Nora was awake, which Clara was not sure was a good sign. The child was lying very still in the way of someone who has learned that stillness costs less than moving, and her eyes, when Clara came in with the lamp, were too bright and too large in her small face. "It hurts to swallow," Nora said. "I know, sweetheart." Clara set the lamp on the table and put her hand on the child's forehead, her cheek, the back of her neck, gauging, measuring. The heat was significant, higher than Cal's had been on his worst night. "I'm going to bring you some water and something to help with the fever. I need you to drink everything I bring, even if it's hard." "Is it bad?" Nora said. Clara looked at her. She'd made a decision in the weeks she'd been here never to lie to this child, not in the condescending way that adults lied to children when they thought the truth was too much for them. Nora had lived through her mother's death and understood perfectly well that bad things happened, and she would know a lie when she heard one. "It's enough that I'm taking it seriously," Claire said. "That's honest. You deserve honest." Nora looked at her with those watchful eyes. "Are you scared?" "Yes," Claire said. "A little. But being scared and doing the work at the same time is something I'm good at. So you don't need to worry about me." Nora seemed to consider this. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Clara said. "Now drink this." Cal was in the hallway when Clara came out. She hadn't heard him get up, but he was there in his nightshirt, leaning against the wall with his arms folded, and she could see from his face that he'd been listening. "How bad is she?" he said. Clara looked at him. 11 years old and trying so hard to be older than that, standing in the dark hallway with his jaw set like his father's. She thought about telling him something soothing and discarded it. "It's a serious fever," she said. "I'm managing it. Your father's gone for a doctor." "What do you need me to do?" She looked at him for a moment. This boy who had spent the first weeks of her presence in this house trying to make himself impossible to reach, who had used her name for the first time 3 days ago when he was sick and trying not to show he was frightened, who was standing here now, at 11 o'clock at night, asking what he could do. "I need more water," she said. "Hot and cold both. And the fire in the hall needs building up. I need the upstairs warm, but not too warm. Can you do that without waking yourself up too much?" "I just recovered," he said, with a particular flatness that in another context would have been almost funny. "I'm not going back to sleep anyway." "Then yes," she said. "I could use the help." He pushed off the wall and went downstairs, moving quietly, and Clara went back into Nora's room. The next 3 hours were the kind that exist outside of regular time, the hours that are both very long and, in memory, compressed to almost nothing, because every minute is so full that they pile on top of each other and lose their individual shape. Clara worked. That was the plain description of it. She worked with the willow bark and the wet cloths and the elderberry tincture that Gertrude had brought, and she worked with the water that Cal kept bringing up in steady, reliable intervals, and she worked with the knowledge she'd assembled over the past weeks, Gertrude's instructions, her own reading, the things she'd learned managing Cal's illness 3 days ago. The neck, not the forehead. Keep them drinking. Don't panic. She wasn't panicking. She was something else. A kind of frightened precision. A state she didn't have a clean name for, where the fear sat right there, and she worked around it the way you work around a hot stove. It was there. She wasn't pretending it wasn't, but it wasn't in charge. Nora talked sometimes and was quiet sometimes, and the talking was worse to manage than the quiet. Not because the content of what she said was distressing, though sometimes it was, but because the talking cost the child energy she needed, and Clara had to find ways to quiet her without frightening her. At one point, a little after midnight, Nora said, "Tell me about before you came here." Clara wrung out a cloth and laid it at the back of the child's neck and sat on the edge of the bed. "What do you want to know?" "What was it like, where you lived?" "Missouri," Clara said. "Flat like here, but greener in summer. I taught school. 23 children in one room." "Were they loud?" "Extremely." Nora almost smiled. "Did you like it?" "I like the work of it," Clara said. "Teaching someone to read is one of the better things you can do for a person. Mama taught me the beginning, Nora said. Her voice was slower now, thicker. Before I went to school, she taught me the letters at the table. That's a good memory, Clara said. I keep forgetting things about her, Nora said very quietly. I don't want to, but I keep forgetting what her voice sounded like when she wasn't, when she was just talking regular. Not sick, just regular. Clara was quiet for a moment. The regular ones are the hardest to keep, she said. They're so ordinary that you don't know you need to hold on to them until they start to go. That's not forgetting. That's just how memory works. The important things stay. The feeling of her. That stays. Nora was quiet. Her eyes were closing, which was what Clara wanted. She would have liked you, Nora said, barely audible. I think. Clara pressed her lips together. Rest, she said softly. I'm right here. The fever climbed instead of breaking. By 2 a.m, Clara knew it, and the knowing was a cold, clear thing that settled in her chest and sat there. The tinctures were working, but not fast enough. The cloths were helping, but not enough. The fever was the kind that had momentum. She'd read about this, had heard Gertrude describe it, the kind that fed on itself and had to be met with something stronger than patience. Cal appeared in the doorway. He'd been making trips every 20 minutes or so, quiet and reliable, and she'd stopped being surprised by him. He looked at Nora and then looked at Clara with the question he didn't say out loud. The same, Clara said, which was both true and not the whole truth. He came further into the room and stood by the window. How long until Papa's back? I don't know, a few hours at best if he finds a doctor quickly. She paused. Cal, do you know if your mother kept any... Your father mentioned once that she used a root preparation for fever, something she made herself. Do you know if there's any left? He looked at her. She kept things in the box under the pantry shelf, he said. The tin box. I don't know what's in it. Can you get it? He was already moving. Clara stayed with Nora, keeping the cloth rotation going, monitoring the child's breathing, which was still steady if too fast. The lamplight made everything look more dire than it might be, she told herself. That was what lamplight did. She didn't entirely believe herself, but she kept the thought nearby. Cal came back with a flat tin box, old and dented, with a latch that he'd already opened. He held it out to her. Inside were small paper packets, each one labeled in a hand that was not Elias's. Neat, careful script, the kind that came from someone who valued precision. Margaret's handwriting. Clara felt something move through her that was not simple, and she set it aside because this was not the moment. She went through the packets quickly, reading the labels. Dried plants, mostly, some familiar and some not. Then one that made her pause. Feverfew, with a note in that same neat hand. For high fever, combine with cold water and honey if available, use sparingly. Is there honey in the pantry? She said. There was some left, Cal said. Not much. Get me what there is. He went, and Clara opened the packet and measured out what she thought was a careful amount, not certain she was right, but trusting the instinct that had gotten her this far tonight. When Cal came back with the small jar, she combined it according to the note, and then sat and coaxed it into Nora in small, patient sips, talking quietly to the child the whole time, keeping her awake enough to swallow. Cal sat on the floor on the other side of the bed, his back against the wall, his knees up. He didn't say anything, and neither did she. The silence between them was different from the silence of the first weeks. It had substance now, and weight, and something that was not yet easy, but was no longer adversarial. After a while, he said, She kept those packets for years. I didn't know what was in them. Your mother was thorough, Clara said. She was. A pause. She was good at practical things, like you. Clara looked at him. He was looking at the wall, not at her, and his expression was the complicated one he wore when he was feeling something he hadn't decided whether to let out. That's not... He stopped, started again. I wasn't saying you're the same. I know you're not the same. I know, Clara said. I just meant... He rubbed the back of his neck. She would have known what to do tonight, too. She would have just done it. So I'm doing it, Clara said. In her house, with her remedy, because she was smart enough to write it down. That's not me replacing anything. That's her still taking care of her children. Cal looked at her then. A direct look, The first one he'd given her voluntarily that wasn't a challenge. His eyes were wet, which he would have died rather than admit, and she looked away quickly and went back to monitoring Nora's breathing to give him the privacy to manage his face. The fire crackled. The lamp burned low. Nora's breathing steadied fractionally, and Clara kept her hand at the child's neck and counted breaths and waited. Elias came back at 4 in the morning with a doctor named Aldous Crane, who was 60 years old and had been roused from bed in a town called Millhaven, and who had the particular manner of a man who had seen a great deal of suffering and had not become cruel from it, but had become very economical. He came upstairs, examined Nora without ceremony, asked Clara a series of rapid questions about what she'd used and when, and listened to her answers with an attention that felt professional rather than politely indulgent. The feverfew was right, he said, which was the first thing he said that wasn't a question. The neck compresses were right. You kept her drinking? Every hour. Good. He was already into his bag. The fever's high, but it hasn't crested yet. We're going to bring it down in the next hour, or it'll crest, and then we'll have a harder fight. I need more cold water, and I need space to work. Clara stood and moved back without being asked, taking Cal's arm as she went and steering him out into the hallway. Elias was right behind them. The three of them stood in the narrow hallway outside Nora's closed door, and Clara looked at Elias. He was not well. That was the simple way to say it. He'd ridden hard and it showed, but it was more than the riding. He was standing with his back against the wall and his eyes on the door, and the expression on his face was the one she'd been watching him manage since Cal's fever 3 days ago, the one she'd seen glimpses of in the kitchen and at the barn, and late at night when he thought no one was watching. A grief so old it had become part of his posture, a fear so practiced, it sat on him like a second coat. She put her hand on his arm. Not dramatic, just a hand on his arm, solid and present. He looked at her. She's going to be all right, Clara said. You don't know that, he said, very quiet. No, she agreed, but the doctor's in there and she's been getting the right things all night and she's still fighting. That's what we've got right now. That's real. He put his hand over hers on his arm, just for a moment. It was brief and worn out and not at all like the gesture you'd find in a story about romance. It was the gesture of a man who was exhausted and frightened and who had found, in the past months, something in this particular woman that felt like the first solid ground he'd stood on in a very long time. Cal sat down on the floor against the opposite wall with his knees up and his head back and closed his eyes. And Clara looked at him and thought he was probably going to be asleep in 3 minutes. She was right. Chet. The fever crested at just after 5 in the morning. Clara knew it was cresting because Nora went very still and her breathing changed, shallower and faster. And Dr. Crane called for more cold cloths in a tone that was urgent without being panicked, which was a tone she recognized and matched immediately. Elias stood in the corner and she had told him quietly to stay there and stay out of the way. And to his credit, he did, because he understood that the most useful thing he could do right now was not need managing. Clara worked. She handed what was needed before Crane asked for it, half the time, because she'd been in this room for 6 hours and she knew what came next. He noticed this and didn't comment on it, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Nora made a sound once that was small and high and involuntary, and Clara heard Elias make a sound in the corner that was the sound of someone absorbing something very hard, and she said, without looking up from what she was doing, "She's fighting. That's what that is. She's not giving up. She's fighting." She didn't know if that was medically precise. She knew it was true in the way that mattered right now. Then, at 5:23, she would remember the time precisely, the way you remember the exact moment a storm breaks. Nora's breathing changed again. Slower. Deeper. The particular quality of someone moving from crisis into something that was not yet recovery, but was no longer crisis. Dr. Crane sat back. He was quiet for a moment. "The fever's turning," he said. Clara let out a breath that had been held for longer than she knew, Chad. By 6, the fever was measurably lower. By 7, Nora was sleeping. Genuinely sleeping, not the awful half-conscious state of the worst hours, but actual sleep. Crane left instructions that were clear and practical and said he'd come back in 2 days if the road was passable. And then he accepted the payment Elias offered without discussion and went down to the kitchen for coffee, which Clara made him, and then he was gone. The house was quiet. Elias sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands, looking at nothing in particular. Cal had woken when the house started moving again and was sitting across from his father in a state of exhausted, relieved silence. Clara sat down, finally, for the first time in something like 8 hours. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Cal said, "She was awake for a while in the night, Nora. She was talking to you." He looked at Clara. "What did she say?" "She asked about Missouri," Clara said. "That's all?" "That's most of it." Cal looked at the table. "She said something to me too. Before it got bad, she said—" He stopped. "She said she thought things were better now, with you here." He wasn't looking at anyone. I thought you should know she said that." Clara looked at him. This boy who'd stood in the barn loft with red eyes and refused to acknowledge them, who'd carried up water at 2 a.m. without being asked, and sat on the floor of his sick sister's room all night because he couldn't stand to be elsewhere. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He nodded once. Then he pushed back from the table and said he was going to check the livestock, which they all understood meant he needed some air and some time with his own face, and he went. Elias looked up from the table. "Clara," he said. "You should sleep," she said, "before you say anything important. You've been up all night and you're not going to say it right." He almost smiled, the corner of his mouth, the same way as that first week. "You're probably right." "I usually am," she said. "Go." He went, and she sat alone in the kitchen for a few minutes in the early morning light, the kind of light that has no pretension to it, just light, plain and useful, coming through a window she'd learned the angle of over the past 2 months, in a house she had not been born to but was beginning to know the way you know a thing you've worked hard for. She was tired in a way that went all the way to the bottom of her. She was also, she realized, sitting in her kitchen, at her table, in a house where she had just fought through the night for a child who was sleeping peacefully upstairs, where a boy had told her, in the most indirect way possible, that things were better with her here, where a man had put his hand over hers in a dark hallway and not had to explain why. She thought about the bench, the hotel bench in Granger's Hollow, and the 3 men, and the afternoon that had seemed like an ending. She sat with her coffee and let herself feel it, the tiredness and the relief and the particular quality of something that was not yet happiness but was in the same neighborhood. Outside, the sun was fully up. The ranch was starting its day. She could hear the cattle, distantly, and the sound of Cal at the barn, and a bird somewhere that had no interest in anyone's difficulties. She finished her coffee. She got up. There was breakfast to make, and a child upstairs to check on, and 100 other things that would need doing before the day was half over. The ranch didn't pause for exhaustion. She'd known that from the first morning, and she still knew it now. But she stood at the window for just a moment before starting, and looked out at the land that was flat and wide and honest in its demands. The same land she'd driven across in the dark 6 weeks ago, thinking she was going towards something unknown and possibly regrettable. And she thought, I live here. Not as a statement of fact, as something closer to acknowledgement, as the kind of thing you say when you finally notice that the ground under your feet has been yours for a while and you've only just looked down. She turned from the window and started on breakfast, and the house came alive around her with its ordinary sounds, and it was enough. Nora recovered slowly, the way children do when they've been genuinely ill. Not the dramatic bounce back that people hoped for, but a gradual, uneven return, where she'd seem nearly herself for an hour and then need to sleep for 3. Clara managed this without fuss, adjusting the household rhythm around the child's needs the way water adjusts around a stone, not fighting the shape of things but moving through them. The epidemic continued to the south and west of them, but it didn't come to the Boone Ranch. Whether this was management or fortune or some combination of both, Clara couldn't say. The Sayers' place came back to life after 2 weeks. Smoke from the chimney again, the sound of their dogs. And word came through the Carver Ranch that the worst of it had passed through Cradle Fork and was thinning out. Dr. Crane made his promised return visit and declared Nora on the right side of it, checked Cal's lungs while he was there, accepted another cup of coffee from Clara, and told Elias he had a capable household, which was the most he said about anything that wasn't medical. After he left, Elias repeated this to Clara, standing in the yard. He said capable. High praise from that man, Clara said. I thought so too. He looked at her for a moment. I've been thinking about what to say to you. Since that morning, I keep starting it and it comes out wrong. Then don't start with words, she said. You're not good at leading with words. You're better at just doing the thing. He almost laughed. The real version, not just the corner of his mouth. That's accurate. I know, she said, and went back inside. The thing he did, 3 days later, was build her a shelf. It was not a grand gesture. It was a shelf for the back of the kitchen, where she'd mentioned, once, in passing, more than a month ago, that she kept running out of places to put things while she was cooking. She came downstairs one morning to find him already at it, working before breakfast, measuring twice the way he did everything. He didn't mention that he was doing it or why. He just built it, solid and level. And when it was done, he cleaned up the sawdust and went out to the range without saying anything about it. Clara stood in the kitchen and looked at the shelf for a moment. It was a good shelf. Sturdy. The wood was smooth where he'd planed it. She put things on it. She didn't say anything to him about it either, but that evening when she brought his coffee to the table, she set it down in front of him and let her hand rest on his shoulder for a moment before she moved away. Brief and deliberate. He went very still while it happened, the way he went still when something surprised him. And then he picked up his coffee and went back to his accounts. That was how it was going between them. In increments. In the language of practical people who don't have a clean vocabulary for the thing that was accumulating between them, and aren't sure yet whether naming it makes it more real or more fragile. Cal turned 12 in the 3rd month of Clara's time at the ranch, and the birthday itself was a modest affair. Nora had requested that Clara make the molasses cake their mother used to make, which meant Nora had to describe it from memory, and Clara had to interpret those descriptions into an actual recipe. And the result was not precisely what Margaret had made, but was close enough that Nora's face, when she tasted it, went through something complicated and beautiful and sad all at once. Cal ate 2 pieces without comment. Afterward, in the particular way that significant days sometimes allowed for things that ordinary days didn't, he and Clara ended up at the barn together in the late afternoon while Elias and Nora were inside. He was brushing down one of the horses, and she was there to check on a latch she'd noticed coming loose, and they worked in the comfortable silence that had replaced the hostile silence of the early weeks, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. After a while, Cal said, I've been thinking about what I said to you that night, when Nora was sick. What about it? I said things were better with you here. He kept his eyes on the horse. I wanted you to know I meant it. I wasn't just saying it. I knew you meant it, Clara said. I was hard on you before that, he said. I know I was. You were grieving, she said. Still are, probably. That's not an excuse. No, she agreed. But it's a reason, and reasons matter even when they're not excuses. I wasn't angry at you, Cal. I want you to know that. I understood what you were doing. He was quiet for a moment. She's not coming back, he said, and the flatness of it was the particular flatness of someone who has said something 100 times in their own head and is saying it out loud for the first time. Mama, I kept thinking, for a long time after she died, I kept thinking that if I just didn't let anyone else in, it was like keeping a space for her, keeping the door open. Clara set down the latch and looked at him. But she's not coming back, he said again. And I was just keeping the house cold. Cal, she said. He looked at her finally. She doesn't go anywhere because I'm here, Clara said. That's not how it works. Your mother's in this barn and in this house and in that cake your sister asked me to make. She's in the way you check things twice before you're satisfied, which is the same way your father does it. She's in the box of remedies under the pantry shelf that kept your sister alive. She paused. I'm not filling a space. I'm standing next to one. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment with those eyes that had started to lose some of their hardness. Not all of it, because he was 12 and had learned too early that the world could take things from you and that knowledge doesn't go away. But some of it. Okay, he said. She picked up her latch tool and went back to the door. He went back to the horse. They worked in the silence that wasn't hostile anymore and hadn't been for some time. What? Elias finally said the thing he'd been failing to say on a Thursday evening in early spring, which was 3.5 months after Clara had stepped off the stagecoach in Granger's Hollow and sat on a hotel bench and refused to cry. They were on the porch after supper. This had become a habit. In the weeks since the epidemic passed, and the household had settled back into something that was, if not entirely ordinary, then at least consistently itself. Nora and Cal would clear the table, which was the deal they'd struck, and Elias and Clara would sit on the porch for 20 minutes or so while the evening came on, not always talking, just sitting. It was a small thing. It had become one of the things she counted on. The sky was doing something interesting to the west, the kind of sunset that the open country did better than anywhere else. Colors that had no business being that precise, that specific, laid out across the flat horizon like someone had decided to make a point. "I need to tell you something," Elias said. "All right." He had his hands on his knees, elbows out, looking at the sky. He was a man who almost never looked at the sky for pleasure. He looked at it for weather, for information, the way a rancher does. And she noticed that he was looking at it differently right now, like he needed somewhere to look that wasn't at her. "When you came here," he said, "I told you I couldn't promise love, that I didn't know what I had left of it. I remember. I was being honest when I said it. I wasn't holding anything back. I genuinely didn't know." "I know you were being honest," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The sky did its thing to the west. Something called from a distant field, one of the cattle, moving slow in the evening. "I know now," he said. Clara looked at her hands in her lap. "I know I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm not someone who says things easily. You know that about me by now. I'm not going to dress it up and make it sound like something from a sentimental story. But I think you should know what's true, and what's true is that I—" Another stop. She could hear him working at it, finding the honest version through the brush. "What's true is that I don't know how I managed this place, or those children, or myself, before you were here. And I'm aware that's not the same as— it's not poetry, but it's what I actually feel." "Elias," she said. "I'm not finished," he said. She waited. "I love you," he said plainly. The way he said everything that mattered to him, directly, without ornament, like a man setting down something heavy he's been carrying. "I love you, and I should have found a way to say it before now, and I'm sorry it took me this long." The sunset was considerable. The air smelled like grass and the particular cold, clean smell of early spring evenings on the frontier. Inside the house, she could hear Nora and Cal arguing mildly about something domestic and completely inconsequential. "You don't have to say anything back," he said. I'm not saying it to put something on you." "I know you're not," she said. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her, had moved from the sky to her at some point while he was talking, and he was looking at her the way he looked at things he was trying to understand accurately. The tired, honest face, the jaw that was always a little set, the eyes that didn't lie very well. "I came here with nothing," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I came here with $42 and no prospects and 3 rejections in one afternoon. I wasn't looking to fall in love. I was looking to survive and maybe, if things went well, to build something." He nodded, once. "I've built something," she said, "and somewhere in the building of it, without planning it or deciding it, She made a small, slightly frustrated gesture, because she realized, not much better at this than he was. "I love you too. I have for a while. I didn't say it because I was waiting for the right. It never felt like exactly the right moment." "There's never a right moment," he said. "No," she agreed. "There isn't." They sat with that for a moment. Inside, the mild argument between the children had resolved into laughter, which was one of her favorite sounds in this house. Nora's high laugh and Cal's reluctant one, the sound of 2 siblings who were still mostly intact. Elias reached over and took her hand, not dramatically, just took it, the way he did practical things, and held it. They sat on the porch while the sky finished what it was doing and the evening settled down around the ranch. And it was not a perfect moment, and she would not have wanted it to be. It was just the 2 of them on a wooden porch on a working ranch in early spring, both tired, both imperfect, both in possession of a feeling they'd managed to get around to naming. It was enough. It was, in fact, considerably more than enough. Rufus Calloway came to the ranch on a Saturday in late spring, which was the last thing Clara expected, and as it turned out, the last thing she needed. She saw the horse coming up the track from the window and didn't recognize it at first, and then she did recognize it and stood at the window for a moment with a dish towel in her hand, running a quick internal accounting of what this visit might mean. Rufus Calloway, who had looked at her hands and her face in the back room of the land office and told her she didn't meet his standard, who had been, in her memory of that day, neither the cruelest of the three men nor the kindest, but simply the most thorough in his indifference. Elias was out at the east pasture. Cal was with him. Nora came in from the back room. "Someone's coming?" "Yes," Clara said. "Go finish your reading. I'll handle it." She went to the door and opened it before he reached the porch, because she'd learned that frontier courtesy required greeting visitors before they had to announce themselves, and also because she had no interest in being caught off guard. Rufus Calloway had not changed significantly in the 4 months since she'd last seen him. He was still a big man with a red face, still with the manner of someone accustomed to his own opinion being the last one that mattered. He pulled up and looked at her from his horse with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "Mrs. Boone," he said, and the name sat oddly, she thought, like he was testing the sound of it. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "what can I do for you?" He got down from his horse with the heaviness of a large man who doesn't enjoy dismounting. He held his hat and looked at her, and she watched him work toward whatever it was he'd come to say. "I heard you've been doing well out here," he said. "Word gets around." "Does it?" "The business with the epidemic. What you managed with the Boone children." He shifted his hat between his hands. "People have been talking." "People talk about most things," she said. "Is there something specific that brings you out, Mr. Calloway?" He looked at her steadily. "My situation has changed," he said. "My mother, she passed in January. The mill has been... I've been finding it difficult, managing alone." Clara waited. "I wanted to say," he said, and the words were slower now, more effortful, "that I made a mistake. When you came out in November, the way I assessed things." He stopped. "You deserved better treatment than you got from me." She looked at him. He seemed to mean it, she thought. Not out of guilt exactly, but out of the particular recalculation of a practical man who has updated his information and is revising his conclusions. She supposed that was worth something. "I appreciate you saying that," she said. "Truly, it was a hard afternoon and the manner of it was unkind." He nodded. "I was wondering, he cleared his throat, "if things had worked out differently, if I mean to say, if your circumstances were not what they are." Clara looked at him. "I'm sorry?" He shifted his hat again. "I suppose I'm asking whether there might be any possibility—" "No," she said. He stopped. "I want to be clear," Clara said, and her voice was entirely steady, not unkind, but absolutely certain, the voice she'd used with the children when something needed to be settled without room for interpretation. "I am Elias Boone's wife. I am Cal and Nora's—" She paused, because the word was one she hadn't used aloud before, and she found, saying it now, that she meant it without reservation. "I am their mother, near enough. I am this ranch's household. This is my life, and I've built it, and I wouldn't trade it for anything you have to offer." Calloway looked at her. Something moved through his expression that she might have felt sorry for in another context. A man arriving late at a conclusion he could have reached months ago if he'd been looking properly. "She wouldn't have fit anyway," he said, half to himself. "You wouldn't have fit. I mean, at my place. You're—" He gestured vaguely. "You're larger than that." She wasn't sure if it was a compliment or just an observation, but it didn't especially matter. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Calloway," she said. "It was courteous of you to say what you said. I mean that. Have a safe ride back." He put his hat on. He nodded. He got back on his horse with the same heaviness as before and turned back down the track, and Clara watched him go until he was a receding shape in the spring distance. She stood on the porch for a moment after he was gone. The air was warm and smelled like the new grass that had been coming up along the south fence, and somewhere on the east pasture she could hear very faintly the sound of cattle moving. Elias and Cal would be coming in for the midday meal in an hour. Nora was inside, probably ignoring her reading in favor of something more interesting. She thought about the bench in Granger's Hollow, the three men, the afternoon, the particular architecture of that particular failure. She thought about what she'd felt sitting there, the weight of it, the flatness, the way the afternoon had pressed down on her and she'd refused, by a combination of stubbornness and simple lack of alternatives, to be pressed flat. She thought, I am so glad he said no. Every one of them. I am so thoroughly, completely glad. It was not a gracious thought. She let herself have it anyway. She was in the kitchen when Elias and Cal came in, and she listened to them at the door. The boots on the mat, the brief exchange about the fence on the east line that needed attention this week. Cal's opinion on this delivered with more confidence than he would have offered 4 months ago. She listened to the comfortable, functional noise of them and set the meal on the table. When they came in, Elias looked at her with the attentiveness that she'd noticed in him in the past weeks, the way he looked at her when he came in from work, a brief checking in, present and specific, not theatrical. He'd always been watchful. It was just directed more deliberately now. Someone came by, she said, sitting down. I saw a horse on the track from the far field, he said. Who was it? Rufus Calloway. Elias set down his fork. What did he want? To apologize, initially, she said, then to suggest, somewhat indirectly, that if I were not currently married, he might be interested in reconsidering his earlier assessment of my suitability. Cal, across the table, went very still and looked from his father to Clara with an expression of absolute attention. Elias was quiet for a moment. His face was doing the thing it did when he was keeping something contained, the jaw slightly tighter than usual. And what did you say? I said no, Clara said. Clearly. Another pause. Did he take it well? He took it like a man who's recalculating and not entirely enjoying it. He was civil. She picked up her fork. He said I was larger than his situation. I think it was meant as a compliment. But Cal said, what does that mean, larger than his situation? It means she outgrew what he was offering before he even made it, Elias said. And there was something in his voice, dry and certain, and with an edge of something that was not quite possessive but was in that vicinity. Clara looked at him. That's not inaccurate, she said. Something settled between them across the table. Not dramatic, just settled, the way things settle when they've found their right position. Cal looked between this with the expression of a 12-year-old who is picking up on something he doesn't have the full vocabulary for, but understands in outline. He went back to his food. Eat, Nora told him, before it gets cold. I know, Cal said. You were just sitting there. I was thinking. Think and eat at the same time. That's what I do. That explains a lot about your thinking, Cal said, which was the kind of thing he'd never have said 4 months ago, and which now made Clara have to look at her plate for a moment to manage her expression. Nora threw a piece of bread at him. Elias said, Nora, without much heat. The meal continued. The afternoon sun came through the kitchen window the way it did at this hour, at this time of year, falling at a specific angle that Clara had learned without meaning to, the way you learn the habits of a place when you've lived in it long enough. Outside, the ranch went on doing its things. The cattle, the fence, the east pasture that needed work, the shelf he'd built her in the early weeks, solid and level and full of things. This was the life, not the version she'd come to Granger's hollow imagining, with its correspondent arrangements and its careful letters and its hope of something decent and manageable. This was the real one, the one that had arrived sideways, in the form of a tired man kneeling on a bad knee outside a hotel, honest about what he had and what he didn't. She hadn't wanted this. She hadn't known to want it. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was settling into its nighttime sounds, Elias came to find her where she was sitting with the mending. This was not unusual. They often sat together in the evenings, working or reading, or sometimes just sitting without doing either, which was a form of companionship she'd come to value without entirely expecting to. But tonight he sat down and looked at her directly, in the way that meant he had something prepared, which was different from his usual approach of working toward a thing from the perimeter. I want to ask you something, he said. All right. That bench, he said. The day you came in on the stage, when you were sitting there after, he stopped. I've been thinking about what it looked like from the outside. 3 men in one afternoon in front of the whole town. It was comprehensive, she said, in its humiliation. I know. And I came up to you with a proposal that was, He made a gesture. That wasn't anything a person dreams of. It was practical and honest and not particularly romantic. That's accurate. I want to know if... He stopped, started again. You've been here 4 months. You've held this household through an epidemic and a crisis and all the ordinary difficulty of every day. You've managed my son, which most people couldn't have done. You've made this house... He looked at the room around them, the room that had felt when she arrived like a house still waiting for its missing piece. You've made it feel right again, like a home. She waited. I want to know if you're... He was struggling, and she knew it, and she let him. If you're satisfied with this, I know it's not what you imagined. I know I'm not easy, and the children weren't easy, and the work is... I know how hard the work is, and I want to know honestly if you'd choose this again, knowing what you know now. Clara set down the mending. She thought about what the honest answer was, because she owed him honesty the same way he'd offered it to her from the beginning. She thought about the difficulty, the early weeks, Cal's hostility, the epidemic, the night of Nora's fever, the 1,000 ordinary hard things that hadn't stopped being hard just because she'd gotten better at them. She didn't edit these out of the accounting. Then she thought about the shelf, the night in the hallway with his hand over hers, the kitchen at breakfast with the 4 of them at the table, and the bread that Nora had thrown, and the reluctant version of Cal's laugh, and the way Elias looked up from his coffee sometimes in the morning with an expression that she thought privately was probably what happiness looked like on a practical man who didn't know he was wearing it. I'd choose this the same day, she said. If I were sitting on that bench right now and you came and asked me, I'd say yes. Faster, probably, knowing what I know. He looked at her. Something in his face was quiet in a way that had nothing tense behind it, which was not his usual quiet. Good, he said. Good, she agreed. He reached over and tucked a loose piece of her hair back, briefly and without ceremony. The kind of gesture that only happens between people who have passed through something together and have decided, on the other side of it, that they are staying. She picked up the mending again. He picked up the account book. The fire made its sounds, and upstairs the house was quiet, and outside the spring dark lay over the ranch the way spring dark does on the frontier, full of things growing that you can't yet see, but that are there, working away in the cold, pointing toward what's coming. She stitched. He calculated. The evening passed between them in the comfortable, ordinary, irreplaceable way of 2 people who have stopped rehearsing and started simply living. And if that was not the love that songs were written about, it was something she had come to understand was considerably more durable, the kind you build with your hands, in the actual hours of actual days, out of honest material. It held the weight of things. That was what mattered. That was what she'd learned. On the bench, and in the wagon, and in the barn, and in the hallway outside a sick child's room in the dark. That the thing you can count on is not the thing that promises to be perfect, but the thing that shows up, imperfect and reliable, and doesn't leave. She finished her stitch. She started the next one. The ranch breathed around her, steady and alive. The first letter came by accident, the way most things that matter do. It was 2 years after Clara had stepped off the stagecoach in Granger's Hollow, and she was sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, one of the rare Sunday afternoons when the ranch work allowed something close to stillness, writing to her brother in Oregon. She hadn't heard from him in nearly 3 years, but she wrote anyway. The way you write to people you've given up expecting an answer from, but can't quite stop talking to. She told him about the ranch, about Elias and the children, about the epidemic and the shelf and the things she'd learned about fever management from a woman named Gertrude Pell, who had become, over the past 2 years, something close to the nearest thing Clara had to a friend on this stretch of frontier. She wrote about what the first months had been like, the difficulty of it, the way she'd sat on that bench in November and made her accounting, the $42, the 3 refusals, the particular quality of that afternoon, and then stood up and made a decision that had no guarantee attached to it whatsoever. She wrote it plainly, without sentiment, the way she'd learned to write from years of keeping records and composing lessons. This is what happened. This is what it felt like. This is what I learned from it, which is that the worst afternoon of your life is sometimes just the afternoon before everything changes, and you can't know which kind of terrible day you're in until you're on the other side of it. She sealed that letter and sent it. She didn't think much more about it. 6 weeks later, she got a letter back, but not from her brother. It was from a woman in a town called Becker's Landing, 200 miles southwest, whose name was Helen Marsh. Helen had somehow come across Clara's letter to her brother. She didn't explain how, and Clara didn't ever find out. And she had copied it and sent it on to a woman she knew, and that woman had sent it to Clara with a note attached that said only, "I thought you should know someone is sharing this." Inside was a letter from Helen Marsh that Clara read 3 times at the kitchen table. Helen was 34. She had been rejected by 2 marriage prospects in the past year and was living with a sister whose patience was thinning. She had read Clara's letter and she wanted. Helen Marsh was the kind of woman who said what she wanted directly, which Clara immediately respected. She wanted to know how Clara had done it. Not the logistics, not the practical arrangement of the thing, but the internal part. The part where you sit on a bench with $42 and 3 refusals behind you and you choose, deliberately, not to let the afternoon destroy you. She wanted to know how that worked, from the inside. Clara sat with this letter for 2 days. She showed it to Elias, who read it and handed it back and said, "You should answer her." "I know," Clara said. "I'm trying to figure out what to say." "Tell her the truth," he said. "That's what you do." She answered Helen Marsh on the 3rd day, in a letter that ran to 4 pages, which was twice what she'd planned. She wrote about the bench again, in more detail this time. She wrote about the specific mechanics of not falling apart, which was less about strength, she'd found, and more about having something immediate to do. A direction to walk, a conversation to engage. She wrote about the way you couldn't always choose your circumstances, but you could choose what you did in the next 5 minutes, and sometimes the next 5 minutes was all you needed to get to a different situation. She wrote about Cal and Nora and the epidemic and the night of the fever. She wrote about the shelf Elias had built without commenting on it. She wrote about the things that had turned out harder than she'd expected and the things that had turned out different from hard in a way she didn't have a precise word for. She sent the letter. She went back to her life. More letters came. Not a flood, not at first, but over the following months, a steady trickle. Women in frontier towns and farming settlements and places Clara had barely heard of, who had somehow gotten hold of one letter or another and written to ask their own questions. Some of them were in circumstances like Helen's. Some were worse. Some were women already in difficult arrangements, already married to men who were indifferent or unkind or simply absent in ways that didn't show on the outside. And they wrote to Clara not because they thought she had answers, but because they'd read something she'd written and felt, for the first time in a while, that someone understood the specific texture of their difficulty. Clara answered every one. Elias noticed the letters accumulating on the desk in the corner of the main room, which had been his desk and was now understood to be shared, and one evening he looked at the stack and said, "How many is that now?" 14 this month, she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Do you have time for 14 letters?" "I make time," she said. "Some of them." She stopped. "Some of them don't have anyone else to write to. I know what that's like. I'm not going to not answer." He looked at her with the particular expression she'd come to know as his version of admiration, which didn't look like admiration from the outside. It looked like careful attention, but which she could read now in the same way she'd learned to read all his expressions, through sustained observation over time. "I'm not asking you to stop," he said. "I was going to say you might need a bigger desk." She bought one in Granger's Hollow the following week, which felt, in its small way, like a declaration. Gertrude Pell came to the ranch on a Tuesday in early autumn, which she did periodically because she and Clara had settled into the kind of friendship that doesn't require occasion. She brought eggs and stayed for coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table, and Gertrude read through a handful of the letters Clara had received, which Clara had shown her because Gertrude had the practical frontier wisdom that Clara had absorbed in the epidemic and continued to find useful in other contexts. "This one," Gertrude said, setting down a letter from a woman named Doris in a settlement called Flat Creek. "She's describing her husband the way my cousin described hers, before things got bad." "I know," Clara said. "I'm trying to figure out what to say to her. I can't tell her what to do. I don't know her situation well enough, and it's not my place anyway." "You don't have to tell her what to do," Gertrude said. "Tell her what you know." About staying and about leaving and about what it costs either way. Let her work out the doing. That's what I've been trying. You're good at it, Gertrude said, in the flat, factual way she offered compliments, which made them feel more reliable than the decorated kind. You write like you talk, clear and without fuss. These women aren't looking for someone to fix it. They're looking for someone to take them seriously. Clara thought about that for a while after Gertrude left. About what it meant to take someone seriously. Not the patronizing version, not the performed empathy of someone who wants credit for caring, but the actual version, which meant reading carefully and thinking carefully and writing back something that assumed the other person was an adult capable of handling honest information. She'd been taken seriously twice in her life before she came to this ranch. Once by her father, who'd treated her intelligence as a practical tool rather than a curiosity. And once, on a bench in November, by a man who'd told her the truth about what he had and what he didn't and had let her decide what to do with it. She understood, sitting at her bigger desk in the corner of the main room, that this was what she was doing in the letters, extending the things she'd been given. Not charity, not instruction, just the honest version of what she knew, offered to people who had a right to it. The travelers started arriving in the third year. The first one was a woman named Bess Holloway, who had written twice, and then in her third letter, mentioned that she was passing through the county on her way north, and asked whether it would be an imposition to stop. Clara had written back that it would not. Bess Holloway arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with a carpet bag and a face that showed the particular exhaustion of someone who has been traveling away from something rather than toward it. She was 38, raw-boned, with a deliberate manner and eyes that evaluated things quickly. She stayed 2 nights. She slept in the room that had become, somewhat organically, a guest room, the small room off the back hall that had been used for storage until Clara had cleared it and put a proper bed in it, with the instinct that eventually someone would need it. She and Clara talked for most of the first evening, after Elias had taken the children to bed, with the easy authority of a man who had learned over 2 years when his wife needed the kitchen to herself. He didn't make a production of it. He just did it, the same way she did 100 things without being asked, the quiet mutual accommodation of 2 people who have learned to read a household together. Bess Holloway talked about what she'd left and what she was going to, and the uncertainty between the two, and Clara listened and asked questions and occasionally said something, and toward the end of the evening Bess said, I don't know what I expected, someone more certain. More arrived. I'm not certain about most things, Clara said. I've just gotten more comfortable with uncertainty. How? Clara thought about it honestly. By noticing that the things I was most uncertain about usually didn't resolve the way I feared they would. Sometimes they resolved worse, but never in exactly the way fear predicted. Fear has a very specific imagination. The real thing is always different. Bess looked at her. That's either very reassuring or not at all. Both, Clara said, depending on the day. Bess laughed, a short, surprised sound, like someone who'd forgotten they could do it. She left the next morning with the carpet bag and the evaluated eyes and something in her posture that was marginally lighter than when she'd arrived. And Clara stood on the porch and watched her go the same way she'd watched Rufus Calloway ride away a year and a half earlier, though with considerably different feelings about the departure. After Bess, there were others. Not many, and not all the time. The ranch was not a way station, and Clara was not running one. But word moved the way word moved on the frontier, through letters and through the particular telegraph of women talking to women about what they'd found useful, and occasionally someone would come through and stay a night or 2. Clara never turned anyone away who needed it, and Elias never suggested she should, which she hadn't expected and which said something about him that she filed away with the other things she'd noticed over the years. Cal left for his first full season of ranch work on the East Range when he was 15, which was both too young and exactly right for who he was by then. He came to say goodbye in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, hat in hand in the same way his father stood when he had something to say, and Clara looked at this boy who had arrived in her life as an 11-year-old wall of silent hostility and had become, over 4 years, someone she would have chosen regardless of any other circumstance. I'll be back at end of season, he said. I know you will, she said. I'll write if I can. You will, she said, because I taught you that writing matters, and you listened to me even when you pretended not to. The corner of his mouth moved. He was 15 and trying to be serious about the departure, and she was undermining it, and he knew she was doing it on purpose. And he also knew that behind it was something that neither of them would say directly because they didn't need to. "Take the jerked meat I packed," she said. "Don't eat it all in the first week." "I won't." "Cal." She waited until he looked at her. "You know how to handle hard things. You've known since you were 11. Don't forget that when it gets difficult out there." He nodded. The seriousness on his face had a different quality now than it had at 11. Less armor, more genuine weight. He'd grown into it. He hugged her. It was brief and not awkward. The hug of someone who has learned that physical affection doesn't have to be negotiated. She held on for a moment before she let him go. She stood on the porch and watched him ride out with his father, who was taking him to meet the crew at the East Range. And Nora came and stood beside her and didn't say anything for a moment. "He's going to be fine," Nora said, which was 13 and trying to sound certain. "He is," Clara agreed. "Are you sad?" Clara thought about this. "A little, and proud. Both at the same time, which is something you'll understand better when you're older." Nora looked at her. "You say that a lot." "It's true a lot." Nora leaned against her shoulder briefly in the easy way she'd been doing since the second year, when the careful distance of the first months had finally given way to something more like what it actually was. Clara put her arm around her, and they stood on the porch in the morning light and watched the two riders diminish on the eastern track. The letters kept coming, and Clara kept answering them, and somewhere in the fourth year something shifted in how she thought about them. It stopped feeling like correspondence and started feeling like work. Real work. In the same way that teaching had been work, the kind that used something essential in her and produced something real on the other side. She started keeping copies of her own letters, which she hadn't done before. She started organizing the ones she received, noticing patterns in what women wrote about, the specific fears, the recurring situations, the particular ways that loneliness and uncertainty and public judgment worked on a person over time. She wasn't sure what she was going to do with this organization, but she did it anyway, with the same methodical instinct that had led her to the inventory of the medicine chest 4 years ago. Elias found her at the desk one evening with stacks of letters sorted into piles, which was not how the desk usually looked. He stood in the doorway and surveyed this and said, "You're thinking about something." "I've been thinking about putting some of these together," she said. "The letters I've written, into something more," she gestured, "into something a person could read as a whole. Not a book, exactly. More like a collection of what I actually know, what's actually useful." He came in and looked at the piles. He picked up one of her copied letters and read a few lines and set it down. "Why not a book?" he said. She looked at him. "That seems presumptuous." "Does it?" He pulled out the chair across from her. He'd started doing this in recent years, sitting down to have conversations rather than having them in passing, which was one of the many small adjustments they'd made to each other over time, each one chosen rather than fallen into. "You've been writing these letters for 4 years. Women pass them around like water. Someone from Becker's Landing showed up on our porch because of something you wrote. I don't know what the definition of presumptuous is, if not that." "That's different from a book," she said. "Not by much," he said. She looked at her copied letters. The handwriting was her own, clear and without fuss, the way Gertrude had described it. The content was what she knew, what she'd learned on the bench and in the wagon and in the kitchen and in the hallway outside a sick child's room, and in the 4 years since, managing a household and a marriage and a correspondence and a life that had arrived sideways and turned out to be the right one. "I don't know that it's enough," she said. "What I know." "What did you say to Helen Marsh in the first letter?" he said. "The one that started all of this." She thought about it. "I told her the truth about what it was like." "And was that enough?" She was quiet. "It was enough for Helen," he said. "It was enough for Bess Holloway to come 200 miles. It was enough for whatever it is you've got sorted into those piles." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on the table, the way he leaned when he meant what he was saying to land properly. "Clara, you sat on a bench with $42 and said yes to a stranger and built something real out of it. The least presumptuous thing in the world is to tell people how you did it." She looked at him for a long moment. This man she had chosen and kept choosing every day through the ordinary hard work of a life lived without guarantees. "You'd have to let me use the desk," she said. I'll build you another one, he said. He did. She didn't call it a book in the end. She called it a collection of letters, which was accurate because that's what it was. The letters she'd written and rewritten and organized over 4 years, edited for clarity and arranged into something that had a beginning and a through line and an ending. She sent it to a printer in the county seat who did small print runs for churches and civic organizations, and she paid for it herself from money she'd put aside over 2 years, and she did not tell anyone it was coming until it was done. The day it arrived, a box of 50 copies, which was all she'd ordered, she sat at the desk for a long time looking at it before she opened the box. Nora came in and said, "What's in there?" "Something I made," Clara said. Nora looked at her face and then looked at the box and sat down. "Can I see?" Clara opened the box. Nora picked up a copy and turned it over and read the cover, which said, very simply, "Letters from the Frontier, What I Know About Starting Over," by Clara Boone. She looked at it for a moment and then looked at Clara with an expression that was 17 and trying not to be visibly moved by something. "This is about you," Nora said. "Parts of it," Clara said. "Parts of it are about other women. Parts of it are about things I learned from people who knew more than I did." She paused. "Parts of it are about your mother, in a way, that box under the pantry shelf." Nora held the small book. Her expression was doing the complicated thing it still sometimes did when Margaret came into a conversation. Not grief exactly, not anymore, but something that was its descendant, a love that had learned to exist in the past tense. She would have liked that, Nora said, being part of it. "I thought so too," Clara said. "That's why I put it in." She sent copies to Helen Marsh and Bess Holloway and Gertrude Pell and a dozen other women whose addresses she had. She sent one to the printer in case anyone asked about it. She sent one to her brother in Oregon, without comment. She did not expect much. She had learned, by now, that you couldn't predict which things would matter and which wouldn't, so the most useful posture was to do the honest thing and then go back to your life and let the thing be what it was going to be. What it was going to be turned out to be more than she'd estimated. The printer wrote back within the month to say he'd gotten requests for more copies, and could he do another print run. He had gotten inquiries from a dry goods store in Granger's Hollow that wanted to stock it, and from a women's society in a town called Perry Bluff, 50 miles east, that had somehow gotten hold of a copy and wanted to order 15. Gertrude Pell read it twice and came over on a Tuesday and said, without preamble, "You should know this is good, not in a polite way, in a useful way." "I hope so," Clara said. "Hope is for things that aren't sure," Gertrude said. "This is sure." She sat down and accepted her coffee and looked at Clara over the rim of it. "You know what you did, don't you? You wrote down the thing that everyone knows is true, but nobody says because it doesn't sound like wisdom. It sounds too ordinary." "What thing?" "That the way through hard circumstances is not strength. It's just continuing." Gertrude set down her coffee. "People want to think it's some quality they either have or they don't. You wrote it plain. It's a choice you make, minute by minute, and anybody can make it. That's terrifying and comforting at the same time." Clara thought about that, about the bench, about the minutes that had made up that afternoon. The grain mill, Tobias Hecht, Arvid Swan, the walk across the main street, the bench itself, the minutes after the bench when she'd made the accounting, the minutes of deciding. "I didn't know that's what I was saying," she said. "When I said it." "The best things usually aren't known until someone else reads them," Gertrude said. The years that followed did not resolve into anything you could call a perfect ending, because life on the frontier didn't do that, and Clara wouldn't have trusted it if it had. There were hard years and easier years, a drought in the 5th year that forced hard decisions about the herd, a winter that came early and lasted too long. Elias's knee got worse, the one that had been giving him trouble since before she arrived, and they had to rearrange how the ranch work was divided, which required 3 months of argument and negotiation before they found a system that worked, because they were both stubborn in their specific ways, and stubbornness, she had learned, was the quality that kept you going and the quality that most often made you difficult to live with. She wasn't always patient. He wasn't always communicative. They had the particular arguments that people have when they know each other well enough to know exactly where the pressure points are. And they had them. And then they worked through them. And then they went back to being the people they were to each other on the porch in the evenings when the ranch was quiet. Cal came home from the East Range at the end of every season and brought more of himself each time, more formed, more settled in who he was. He had his father's watchfulness and his mother's handwriting, and something that was specifically his own, a dry, precise humor that he'd had at 11 and had simply been too angry to deploy. He talked to Clara about the things he was thinking the way a person talks to someone they trust, not asking permission or approval, but just thinking out loud to someone whose judgment they've decided to take seriously. She did the same with him, which was the thing she valued most. Not that he'd become easy or that the early difficulty had been erased, but that they'd built something real on the other side of it, something that had the particular durability of things that were not given but earned. Nora grew into herself at a speed that was both expected and startling. At 18, she taught school for a season in Granger's Hollow, which she told Clara was her own idea, and which Clara recognized as a thing she'd planted years ago at the kitchen table with a stack of books and an afternoon and a child whose mind ran 3 steps ahead of the lesson. She was good at it. She had a natural authority that came from never having been the kind of person who needed to perform authority. She just had it, and children felt it and responded to it. She came home on weekends and sat at the kitchen table with Clara, and they talked about the teaching, the specific students, the difficulties and the satisfactions, and Clara listened with the pleasure of someone watching a thing they'd put effort into become exactly what it was supposed to be. The letters didn't stop. Even after the collection was printed and reprinted and sent further than Clara had expected, letters still came. Not fewer because the book existed, but perhaps different in quality, more specific, more willing to go into the complicated details that a book couldn't entirely accommodate. Women wrote to her about things that had no clean answer, and Clara wrote back truthfully, including the times when the honest answer was, "I don't know. I haven't faced exactly this. Here's what I know that might be adjacent to it." She was careful, always, not to position herself as someone who had figured something out that others hadn't. That had never been the point. The point was that she had sat on a bench with nothing much to recommend her future and had made a series of decisions that had over time accumulated into a life that she would not have traded, and that the process of making those decisions was not special to her. It was available to anyone who could stand the particular discomfort of uncertainty long enough to come out the other side of it. She wrote this in the letters, and she believed it, and she had the evidence of it in the women who wrote back over the years to say, "I was at the bench. I made the decision. I'm on the other side now, and it's not perfect, but it's mine." That was what she'd wanted, not to be the woman who had answers, to be evidence that the thing was possible. On an evening in the 7th year of their marriage, Clara and Elias sat on the porch after supper in the way they'd been doing for years, and the sky was doing something considerable to the west, and the ranch was quiet in the particular way it got when the work was done and the animals were settled. Nora had taken a permanent teaching position in a town 40 miles north. Cal was running the East Range with a crew of his own now, which still surprised Clara sometimes when she thought about it directly. That 11-year-old wall of silence, in charge of men and making good decisions with a steadiness that she recognized and was not entirely modest about having contributed to. It was just the two of them most evenings now, which was different and not worse. "There's a woman coming next week," Clara said, "from somewhere past Millhaven. She wrote that she'd been turned down by 4 men in 2 years, and she doesn't know what to do next." Elias said. "I told her to come." "Of course you did." She looked at him. "Is that Clara?" He said her name the way he said it when she was asking a question she already knew the answer to. "When have I ever said don't?" She thought about this. He hadn't. Not once in 7 years. There were things she'd learned about love in 7 years that she hadn't known on the bench and couldn't have been told. That it was mostly not the feeling, or not only the feeling, but the decision, repeated every day, to keep orienting yourself toward another person. That it was specific, not general. Not love in the abstract, but love in the form of a shelf built without comment, a horse saddled and ridden through the dark for a doctor, a desk built because the first one wasn't large enough for the work that mattered, that it had to be chosen with open eyes, accounting for the actual person and not the hoped-for version of them. That the actual person, imperfect and specific and sometimes difficult, was the only version worth choosing. She looked out at the land she'd been looking at for 7 years, which still had the particular quality of open country, the honesty of it, the way it offered nothing decorative, just the plain facts of distance and light and weather. She thought about the bench. She thought about it the way you think about a thing that happened to someone who was also you, but was different enough that you can examine it with some distance. That woman with $42 and 3 refusals and nowhere to go, who had sat down and refused to fall apart, and then accepted an imperfect offer from an imperfect stranger because the alternative was standing still. She had not been brave on that bench. She wanted to be clear about that in her own accounting, even if she'd never written it quite this plainly anywhere else. She had not been especially strong or especially wise. She had been without options, and she had been honest, and she had been willing to do the next thing without knowing what came after it. That was all. It turned out to be enough. It was, in fact, the whole of what she'd been trying to say in the letters for 7 years, the thing she'd been working around and approaching from different angles and failing to say as plainly as she now said it to herself in the quiet of an evening on the porch. You don't have to know what comes next. You just have to be willing to go toward it. The rest builds itself, in the hours and the days and the ordinary work of being present in your own life instead of waiting for it to become something you recognize. The woman from past Millhaven was coming next week with her own version of the bench. She'd find a house that was not particularly grand, and a woman who was not particularly certain, and a kitchen table where the coffee was strong and the answers were honest and not always satisfying. She'd find evidence that the thing was possible. That was what Clara had to offer. It was not nothing. It was, she had come to understand, the only thing worth offering, not the performance of having arrived, but the honest account of the journey, including the parts that were still ongoing, including the parts that had never entirely resolved, including the truth that a good life was not a finished thing, but a direction you kept choosing. Elias put his hand over hers on the porch rail. He didn't say anything, neither did she. The sky finished what it was doing to the west and went dark in the slow, generous way of frontier evenings, and the first stars came on, and the ranch was quiet and alive around them. And Clara Boone, who had been Clara Whitmore on a bench with $42 and nowhere to go, sat in the evening she had built and let it be exactly what it was. Not perfect, not what she'd imagined, better than that, real.